In August of 2004, about 2 months into my field work in an industrialized slaughterhouse in Omaha, Nebraska, 6 cattle escaped from a slaughterhouse up the street from the one that I was working in. One of them, a cream-colored HRAE heifer, made a run down the main boulevard in Omaha and took a turn into an alleyway that ended in a chain-link fence bordering the slaughterhouse where I was working. This escape just happened to take place during the 10-minute afternoon break for the slaughterhouse that I was in. And myself, along with some other workers, were out trying to get a brief moment of fresh air and sunshine. So we were able to watch as the HRAE heifer, pursued at this point by the Omaha Police Department, who had been notified to her escape, ran into the alleyway. The police tried briefly to herd her into a waiting trailer that had been pulled up by the slaughterhouse from which she had escaped. And when she failed to comply, they opened fire on her with shotguns and killed her. The next day, the newspaper of record in Omaha, the Omaha World-Herald, featured the escape on its front page with a full photograph under the title, "Freedom is Fleeting for Cattle in Plant Escape." Not only that, in the lunchroom at the slaughterhouse, during our lunch break, the workers expressed outrage and horror and disgust at the shooting of this one heifer by the Omaha Police Department. They shot that cow just like they shot an unarmed man from Mexico last year, said Julia, one of the quality control workers. You know, if you're Mexican in this country, the police will do anything to you. This story frames the industrialized slaughterhouse as an exemplary case of a place that is no place, as what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman refers to as a zone of confinement, a place that is off limits to the vast majority of the members of society who nonetheless rely on it, indeed, who take its products and make them parts of their very bodies. In the United States, a country that kills more than 10 billion land animals each year, that's over 27 million animals who will be killed today alone. The escape of a mere 6 of these animals somehow becomes front-page news. In breaching the slaughterhouse walls, these cattle become not just physically dangerous, but conceptually dangerous. Like anthropologist Mary Douglas's definition of dirt, they become quite literally matter out of place. The public response to their escape points to power relations that work through confinement and sequestration within a society that considers the manure and even the smell of these animals something to be reported to the authorities. Indeed, we know that contemporary industrialized slaughterhouses are physically hidden. They've been relocated out of the urban areas of the kind that Erica referred to yesterday, far into rural areas, out of sight. They're also socially hidden through the delegation of dirty and dangerous work to undocumented immigrants and classes of workers who have few political and social rights. Increasingly, these places are becoming legally hidden through a series of laws known as ag-gag laws, which criminalize the act of going into one of these places in order to reveal to the general public what takes place inside of them. They're linguistically hidden. They're places where steers become steaks, where pigs become pork, where heifers become hamburger. And perhaps more provocatively, they're ideologically hidden. As social psychologist Melanie Joy says, under a system or an ideology of carnism, which normalizes and naturalizes the consumption of other beings for food. And yet, the work of industrialized killing is also sequestered from those who directly participate in it. Recall that the workers who were outraged by the shooting of this one animal one animal by the police department, are the same workers who at the end of that lunch break returned to their places on the kill floor where they proceeded to take part in the killing of another 1,250 of those animals for the remainder of the day. The goal of the research that informs my book, Every 12 Seconds, was to take the slaughterhouse as an exemplary case that would shed some light, shed some insight on how it is that massive processes of violence are carried out on a routine basis in modern civilizations. How, in fact, what we refer to as civilization may not actually reference the reduction or elimination of brutality and violence, but rather the increasing sophistication with which we hide away and subcontract to faraway others in faraway places the violence from which we benefit on a daily basis. And as a PhD student in political science at Yale University at the time, my aim was to explore these themes ethnographically, looking carefully at the lived experiences of those who participate most directly in the violence. And so I gained access, without informing the management of my status as a PhD student, into a slaughterhouse in Omaha, Nebraska, where I worked from June through December of 2004, first as an entry-level worker. This slaughterhouse employs over 800 workers, the vast majority of them undocumented immigrants from Central and South America, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. It's one of the 5 largest cattle slaughterhouses in the United States. There are 2,500 cattle killed each day in this place, which adds up to 10,000 per week, or over 500,000 each year. I worked for 9 to 12 hours each day during the time I was there, first as a liver hanger in the chutes, as a liver hanger in the cooler, then as a chute worker, C-H-U-T-E, driving the live cattle into what's known as the knocking box. And finally, I was promoted to the position of quality control, which made me a player in the regulatory food safety inspection system within the plant. Now, it was serendipity and improvisation, not some kind of rigid a priori research design, that governed my movement through the slaughterhouse. Those of you who have done field work or undercover work of any kind know that you have to seize the moment when they arise. You can't chart beforehand what you're going to be doing. And yet, given my interest in industrialized, routinized violence, I couldn't have chosen 3 better jobs. Liver hanging put me at a maximal distance from the site of killing. Chute work put me at a minimal distance to the site of killing. And finally, my promotion made me a player in the vertical hierarchies and the internal surveillance and disciplinary systems within the slaughterhouse. I think one of the most central findings that emerges out of my movement through the slaughterhouse is that in industrialized, routinized processes of killing, concealment and distancing continue to operate all the way down. There is no simple binary between the hidden and the seen, between the sequestered and the visible, between what is concealed and what is revealed. In fact, surveillance and sequestration can work in concert, and quarantine is possible in, and perhaps even enabled by, conditions of total visibility. I have 2 goals in my talk this morning. The first is to walk you through the slaughterhouse in a very close-to-the-ground way to help you understand what it means from the inside to participate in the work of massive violence while remaining compartmentalized in it. And my second goal this morning is to use this close attention to the slaughterhouse to draw attention to and raise questions about the relationship between transparency and political and social transformation. To raise questions, in other words, about glass walls and the faith that we sometimes put in them. Let's start with a very basic mapping of the departmental divisions in an industrialized slaughterhouse. I think often when the general public or even when animal activists think about the slaughterhouse, they tend to homogenize the slaughterhouse as a single awful place. And it's really important to understand that even within the slaughterhouse, there are departmental segregations that are enormously important in terms of how people experience the work of killing. Indeed, it's possible to spend years working in the front office or the fabrication department of the slaughterhouse, a slaughterhouse that kills over 500,000 cattle each year, without ever once encountering a live animal or witnessing one being killed. As I write of my experience hanging livers for 9 to 10 hours each day in the freezing cooler, and now I'm just going to read to you a short passage from my book. At the rate of one cow, steer, or heifer slaughtered every 12 seconds per 9-hour working day, the reality that the work of the slaughterhouse centers around killing evaporates into a routinized, almost hallucinatory blur. By the end of the day, by liver number 2,394 or foot number 9,576, it hardly matters what is being cut, shorn, sliced, shredded, hung, or washed. All that matters is that the day is once again, finally, coming to a close, offering a brief overnight respite from the roaring, vibrating totality that has come to encompass not only the knives, hooks, and machines that kill, rip, and tear apart the cattle, but also the human arms, legs, and hands that operate these devices. This, too, becomes killing at a distance, laboring day after day, hanging freshly gutted body parts from animals one never saw or heard or smelled or touched in life. The feel of freezing air through multiple layers of clothing, the smell of perforated livers rising to the nostrils in traceable steam, the humming, clanging, clinking, deafening mechanical soundscape, and the sight of liver after liver descending against a dull white wall, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, until it constitutes an endless, infinite landscape in which the slaughtered cow has no place, and against which every act of disruption, no matter how minuscule, becomes an expression of being, of knowing that you are still there. I spend a lot of time in my book describing the front office, the fabrication department, and the cooler. But what I want to do this morning is really focus in on the kill floor itself. That one department, that one space in the slaughterhouse that throws off euphemism and calls itself by what it does, the kill floor. Now, we would expect, wouldn't we, that within a compartmentalized space of the slaughterhouse like this, the kill floor would be the one place where a confrontation with the killing of the animal would be unavoidable. But even here, at the very site, at the very ground zero of killing, we find that divisions of labor and space continue to compartmentalize and sequester any confrontation with the act of killing. This is not a map of the motherboard of your computer. This is a mapping of the industrialized slaughterhouse that I produced over the series of several months of walking the kill floor as a quality control worker. And there's a lot of detail here. And there's no way we're going to be able to work our way through all of it. But just briefly, I'm going to use the screen on my left here, so just look for this little laser pointer as I talk. Each of the circled numbers on this map represent an individual human worker. And each of the numbers correspond to a number in the appendix to my book that describes exactly what that worker is doing for 9 to 12 hours each day in a repetitive sense. The live animals enter the kill floor here and are held in pens before being driven through a serpentine chute, which was designed by Temple Grandin, and which is also known as the Stairway to Heaven, according to her. And then the animals are killed in this area, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And this bold line here represents the overhead rail on which they're hung upside down. And they pass through the slaughterhouse on this overhead rail. And they pass by each of the human workers who stand in a stationary location while they perform one single function on the body of the animal that's passing by. These dotted lines and various hashed lines represent separate production lines for different body parts of the cattle that are removed from the main carcass. So there's a head line, an offal line, a liver line, and so on. As I said, there's no way we're going to be able to cover the detail, but I just want you to appreciate for a moment the complexity of the division of space and labor that's involved with mass routinized industrialized killing in our societies. And just to give you a kind of ethnographic sense of what's involved for the human workers, I'd like a couple people from the audience to just call out a number, and I'll read the corresponding job that that worker performs. And as I read this description, just keep in mind that this is something that someone is doing repetitively for 10 hours a day, day after day, week after week. So there are 121 distinct jobs that are performed by over 200 people on the kill floor. So would someone be willing to read, call out any number between 1 and 121? 23. What? 23. So these descriptions that I'm reading to you come from observation. There is no manual of slaughterhouse workers. They come from direct observation over an extended period of time from my own research. So worker number 23 is known as the second butter, and this worker is located right around here. And the description of work for this worker is that he, because mostly it's a male space, uses an air knife to separate the hide from the flesh around the anus area of the cattle. He does that every day for 10 hours a day at the rate of 1 cow every 12 seconds. Another number. 77. So worker number 77 is located up here. And this worker is known as the offal hanger, or offal hanger. This worker uses his hands to hang hearts and weasand on an offal line and livers on a liver line, and throws the lungs, pancreases, and windpipes, as well as any fetuses from pregnant cattle, down the pet food chute. So that's what that worker does for 9 to 12 hours a day. We could go on and on. We're quite limited in time, so I won't. But I'm not reading these descriptions to shock you. This work is utterly banal for the people who are taking part in it because they're doing it repetitively for 10 hours a day, and I just want you to keep that in mind. What I'm going to do now is just show you a couple of ways of understanding the spatial arrangement of the kill floor. So a couple analytic overlays of how we can begin to understand how space operates even on the kill floor itself to compartmentalize the work of killing. Perhaps one of the most important distinctions in industrialized slaughter on the kill floor is the distinction between the clean side and the dirty side. This distinction organizes all kinds of work. So for example, if you're a worker on the dirty side, you have to wear a gray hard hat. And if you're a worker on the clean side, you have to wear a white hard hat. And workers on the clean side and the dirty side are not actually allowed to interact with each other or mix with each other. And this is true not only of when the work is taking place, but also during breaks and break times. So there is a separate bathroom for dirty side workers that literally has a sign on it that says dirty men's bathroom. And then there's a separate bathroom for the clean men and a separate lunchroom for the dirty men and so on. And this spatial segregation it's enacted right here. This is the zone that separates the dirty side, which is in dark gray, from the clean side, which is in lighter gray. And what happens right here? This is where a machine known as the down puller strips the animal completely of his or her hide, right? And so the reason why this is called the dirty side is because as long as the hide is still attached to the animal, there's a very high probability of fecal material from the hide being transferred to the flesh that's underneath. And the clean side is after the hide has been stripped off. So this distinction, the spatial distinction, the logic, the explicit logic for it is a food safety logic. We don't want contamination from fecal material. But this is what's interesting from my point of view, from the point of view of trying to understand how power is at work in terms of compartmentalization, distancing, and concealment. The workers who are working on the dirty side are still dealing with an animal that has retained his or her animality. When a hide is on an animal, it's very difficult to ignore the fact that this used to be a living creature. Once the hide has been completely stripped off, you are dealing with a very ghostly material. It doesn't, yes, I mean, if you imagine hard enough, you can see how it once was animal, but it has been de-animalized. So this distinction between the clean and dirty side, which ostensibly is driven by food safety, also works to segregate and quarantine the very class of workers who have to confront the animality of the life that they're taking. Right? So you see the ways in which certain kinds of logic, for example, the logic of food safety, end up having effects that are extra to their intentions, but that end up reinforcing the compartmentalization of a confrontation with killing. I can make the point the same way by dividing the space of the kill floor between zones of life, zones of killing, and zones of death. I mean, just take a look for a moment at the spatial distribution and the number of workers who are working in these different zones. The zone of life refers to the area where the cattle are still alive. The zone of killing to the area where their life is being taken, and the zone of death to the area where they're no longer alive. The vast majority of workers on the kill floor work in the zone of death. A very, very small minority work in the zone of life or the zone of killing. And keep in mind, this is just the kill floor. The slaughterhouse is made up of the kill floor, the cooler, and the fabrication department. So we're talking about a subset of workers, a tiny minority of workers who are dealing in the zone of life or the zone of killing. Let's zoom in now. The next map I'm going to show you is going to be a zoom in on the zone of life and the zone of killing, because I want you to understand how even at the very site of killing, there is a level of compartmentalization that is remarkable. This map is color-coded by workers who have direct involvement with the killing, workers who have contact with the live animals, and workers who have some kind of line of sight to the killing, who are able to see what's happening. Just take a look at these numbers. This is out of a workforce of over 800. Only 6 workers have contact with the live animals. Only 4 are directly involved with the taking of life. And only a tiny minority, something like 6, have any kind of line of sight to where that taking of life is taking place. The workers who are directly involved with the killing are mapped on this, are coded on this map in yellow. And I just want to briefly describe the killing process. Again, not to be sensational, but because I think it's very important to understand the level of disaggregation and disassociation that is spatially built into how we take life on a routine basis in our civilized societies. Worker number 3 is known as the knocker. That worker is right here. The live cattle are driven up through the serpentine, as I already mentioned, and they enter the knocking box where this worker uses a captive bolt steel gun that's powered by air compression, presses it against the forehead of each animal, and depresses a trigger, which releases a bolt into the forehead of the animal. And according to Temple Grandin, who is a consultant for the American Meat Institute, this process is supposed to render the animals insensible. It doesn't actually kill them. It's supposed to render them insensible. The animal then is advanced and drops under a conveyor belt, where worker number 4, who's known as the shackler, wraps a metal chain around one of the hind legs and yanks the animal upside down. At this point, the animal is traveling on an overhead rail and goes through, look at this, a floor-to-ceiling wall before taking 2 90-degree turns, where the worker number 7, who's known as the pre-sticker, and worker number 8, who's known as the sticker, do their work on the animal. The pre-sticker creates a small incision in the neck, and the sticker reaches in and severs the jugular artery and the the jugular veins and the carotid arteries. And the animal then proceeds to bleed out. By the way, these are electric stimulation devices designed specifically to keep the animal's heart beating after the throat has been slit, because they need the blood to flow out of the body. Now just look at this for a moment. We'll ignore worker number 5. His work is to check and see whether the cattle are showing any signs of sentience. And if they are, to use a handgun to shoot them again. But he rarely does that. His main job is to keep the spacing on the line even, because industrialized production requires even pacing. But just look at this for a moment. Look at the spatial segregation between worker number 3, who's knocking the animals unconscious, and workers number 7 and 8, who are slitting the animal's throat. These workers are completely out of line of sight to each other. Not only that, they have no line of vision to see what the other workers are doing. So worker number 3 can always say, I'm only stunning the cattle. They're being killed somewhere down the line. I have no idea where, right? And workers number 7 and 8 can say, by the time the cattle get to us, they're already insensible and hanging upside down. What we see here in this architecture of killing is a literal, moral, and experiential dislocation of violence. It is actually impossible to locate violence in this case. And I think this is significant for thinking about how it's possible for massive processes of violence to be perpetuated in what we call civilized societies. The final point I want to make about my time in the slaughterhouse, and again, this is such a brief skimming of the richness in the work, has to do with my job as a quality control worker, where I was promoted and given a uniform and a radio and asked to fill out on an hourly basis different kinds of documentation about the processes of work in the plants, recording temperatures, pressures, acid levels, right, bacteria levels, and checking on the workers, becoming part of the surveillance mechanism of disciplining the workers and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Unofficially, though, my main job was to run interference against United States Department of Agriculture meat inspectors and to keep them from discovering any problems that might cause them to write non-compliance reports for the plant or slow or shut down the line. And those of you who are placing a great deal of faith in regulation or policy around regulation as a way of addressing either food safety or animal welfare issues really need to take a close look at the chapters in my book that show on the ground what happens to regulation, right? The farcical games that are played, the ritualistic, farcical cat and mouse games that are played between the inspectors, the quality control workers, and the kill floor managers are sufficient to fill a novel in and of itself. And if I had more time, I would read a little bit about that to you. But what I want to focus on here is just a brief description of the compartmentalization that can occur even as a quality control worker. What is most remarkable about the work of quality control is the way in which a focus on food safety deflects attention away from the work of killing onto the technical realm of hygiene. The possibility of perceiving and experiencing what happens in industrialized killing is diverted into elaborate performances and deceptions generated by the focus on food safety and the adversarial relationship between the slaughterhouse and the United States Department of Agriculture. For the quality control worker, the experience of the violence in industrialized killing is refracted through a long chain of acronyms, tests, and statistics. HACCP, CCP1, CCP2, SSLP, GMP, lactic acid concentrations, microbacterial carcass swabs, sterilization for head meat sampling, pre-operational inspections and corrective action plans. Sterile and banal in the abstract, the everyday practices of quality control work on the kill floor transform these categories and acronyms into fraught sites of power conflicts. that involve rapidly shifting alliances between quality control workers and United States Department of Agriculture inspectors. Unlike the white and gray hat line workers, right, the workers who are on the line in a specific place, whose workspaces are partitioned and whose divisions of labor are circumscribed, the quality control workers are practically the only participants in the work of industrialized killing who have access to and who are expected to routinely traverse the entire kill floor. But despite this, the technical and bureaucratic requirements imposed by the skirmishes over their responsibilities for the quality of control serve to fragment, segregate, and neutralize the horror of the violent work being performed before their eyes, just as effectively as the walls and the repetitive job functions do for the line workers. For the quality control worker, sight and concealment work together, and quarantine becomes possible even under conditions of total physical visibility. I'm going to shift now to the second part of my talk, which is to ask how this close-to-the-ground look at industrialized slaughter might help us think more richly about the relationship between transparency and visibility on the one hand and social and political change on the other hand. I want you to imagine with me just for a minute a world in which distance and concealment simply fail to operate, okay? Imagine a world in which walls and checkpoints do not block sight, in which the words that we use with one another show plainly what we are doing rather than euphemistically hiding them, and in which those who benefit from dirty, dangerous, and demeaning work are required to actually carry it out themselves. Imagine, if you can, a world that is organized around undermining physical, social, linguistic distance. Would such a world be desirable? Would it? This impulse for transparency, this desire to create ruptures in hidden zones of confinement, is what I refer to as the politics of sight. And I think it's a key characteristic of many political and social movements that assume at their core that to make something visible is to generate social or political change about what's being made visible, right? I mean, in the animal liberation or animal rights movement, the most iconic representation of this idea of the politics of sight comes from Paul McCartney, who's credited with saying, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we'd all be vegetarian. I mean, I think we should all be vegan, but whatever, it's fine. He said vegetarian. But my ethnographic exploration of industrialized killing suggests that the politics of sight, while it might be a necessary condition for social transformation, it's certainly not a sufficient one. And I want to briefly offer, and I can only offer a telegraphic gloss on this, two sort of cautions about the politics of sight. The first is that the underlying emotions generated by the politics of sight or sought after by the politics of sight actually rely for their existence on the very distancing and concealment that the politics of sight is supposedly trying to overcome. So the reactions of pity or disgust or horror or sympathy or compassion that the politics of sight aims for, those emotions, the conditions, the historical conditions of their possibility, are the very distancing and concealment that the politics of sight is trying to overcome. I rely a lot here on the brilliant sociologist Norbert Elias, who wrote a beautiful book called The Civilizing Process, in which he looked at, and this is so genius, the history of manners from the 16th century to the present. Do you know what the very earliest manner books had in them? I'm talking about etiquette books, like Dear Abby kind of things. Do you know what the very earliest manner books had in them? You there. When you're sitting down to dinner, please don't blow your nose on the tablecloth. And can you please stop getting up and peeing in the corner of the room in the middle of the discussion? And you two, stop having sex naked in front of your kids. It's not cool. And what Elias shows is that as we move through the centuries, we see an increasing refinement of what he calls our frontiers of disgust and repugnance. So things that once had to be explicitly instructed against in manner books become so internalized, none of us would pick up a manner book today and read anything like that. What, like, for me to get up and pee in the corner of this room in front of all of you would probably be physiologically impossible. Because I have so internalized, right, shame in relation to that action. But Elias is brilliant in historicizing emotions and responses that we take as timeless and natural when in fact they're not. They're just not. And so this is the first caution, okay? And by the way, Elias's analysis is also brilliant because he correlates expanding frontiers of repugnance and disgust to the rise of the modern state. And what does the modern state do, as Weber tells us? The modern state specializes in exercising a monopoly over the means of violence within a given territory. So for Elias, our increasing sense of shame and disgust and capacity to feel empathy and compassion and horror at certain acts that we think of as violent comes directly from the sanitization of violence from the sphere of everyday life. Makes sense, right? As violence becomes less ubiquitous in everyday life, we become increasingly capable of becoming horrified by it. Caution number one. Caution number two is that promises of visibility are fully compatible with an entrenchment of further concealment and confinement. Things that require us to look, that say, hey, look at me, look at this. They engender both internal and external responses that allow us to look without actually seeing. The act of looking itself can actually become fetishized and even commodified. And what I want to do in the remaining time that I have is walk us together as a group through what I think of as a series of symptomatic cases, okay, that demonstrate the kinds of complexity around transparency and visibility that I really want to get at today. I'm going to take cases from 3 different realms. They're all incredibly interesting. They each are deserving of a full hour lecture in and of themselves. The first realm is going to come from the industry itself. What is the meat industry? What is the animal exploitation industry doing around questions of visibility and transparency? The second sphere that I'm going to take my symptomatic cases from are from the world of social entrepreneurs, trend-setting entrepreneurs. What are they doing around issues of transparency and visibility and animals? And the third sphere is going to come directly from the animal activist movement, okay? What are animal activists doing around issues of transparency and visibility? Let's start with industry. Well, check this out. This is a publication produced last year by the American Meat Institute. This is the primary lobbying group for industrialized killing. They're in support of it. They have taken Paul McCartney's saying about slaughterhouses having glass walls and appropriated it, and produced a publication called If Meat Plants Had Glass Walls, What Would Happen? And this is a 10-page publication. It goes on and on about how industrialized slaughter has absolutely nothing to hide from anyone. And they would be perfectly happy to create slaughterhouses out of glass walls, except it would scare the cattle. And they don't want to do that. This publication is accompanied by a YouTube series that you can watch, except you can't because the network is down, narrated by none other than Temple Grandin, and it is called The Glass Walls Project. And she walks you through a kill floor, well, her version of a kill floor, and tries to show you that the meat industry has absolutely nothing to hide, right? So this is an appropriation of memes of transparency that suggests there's a lot more going on than simply the idea of making something visible. This is going to blow your mind. This is the commodification of tourism to a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation in Indiana. This is a pig farm, okay, where they raise pigs in gestation crates, and all the standard industry practices are in place. But what they have done is created a summer vacation out of visiting their farm. I just want to read you some of the text of this website. This is Fair Oaks Farm in Indiana. This weekend, escape to the country where you can explore family farms and reconnect with nature, animals, and our planet. This is not industrialized agriculture that's trying to hide what it's doing. They're actually commodifying a visit to their farm. Visit Fair Oaks Farm with mind-blowing and entertaining interactive exhibits. Experience agriculture in a whole new way by taking a break in the country. Learn and play in our activity centers. Absorb the farming lifestyle at our modern working farms in the air-conditioned comfort of our farm buses. Sample our award-winning cheeses. Witness the miracle of life at our birthing facilities. But it doesn't stop there. Travel to our newest destination, the pig adventure, and expose yourself to the captivating life of a pig. With state-of-the-art technology, this attraction is sure to make your group squeal with excitement. Transparency and visibility, making money off it. You can get the adventure pass, by the way. It's only $50. By the way, this is not new. This is a handbook from Swift & Company, which was a major meatpacking company in the United States from the late 1800s. And they prepared this handbook to give to visitors who toured their slaughterhouses in Chicago. As Louise Carroll Wade has shown in her brilliant history of the Chicago packing house industry, in 1893, the year that Chicago hosted the World Expo, over 1 million people engaged in slaughterhouse tourism. In other words, visited slaughterhouses as sites of aesthetic and visual consumption. And Nicole Shukin, in her brilliant book, writes, quote, "Animals were not only produced as meat, they were also consumed as spectacle." And I would add to that, not just non-human animals, but the immigrant workers were on display for an upper middle class who had the pleasure of consuming the sight of the slaughterhouse. This book is crazy. If you actually look at it carefully, the protagonist in the book is a little white girl dressed in a white dress who's dragging her middle-class family through the slaughterhouse with a big smile on her face, as if to say, this is just like visiting, an amusement park. Look at this. This is what the meat packing industry itself was saying to people who visited. This little booklet will serve as a reminder of the sites of the stockyards, and being referred to will enable you to see those sites again in memory. Isn't that every animal activist's dream, that people won't forget what a slaughterhouse looks like? But here you have the industry itself commodifying visibility and transparency. Okay, area number 2. From what I call trend-setting capitalists or social entrepreneurs. What are they doing around visibility and sight? I'm going to show you a photo. I want you to take a moment to just digest it. Anybody know who this person is? This is Camus Davis, former vegan, now founder of the Portland Meat Collective, where the objective is to educate ignorant consumers of meat about where their meat actually comes from so that they can consume it ethically. Here she is holding a pig with a group of very privileged private high school students from Portland who are all leaning in a grinning pose over different body parts from this animal who they have collectively personally slaughtered. This photo, by the way, references a very famous Norman Rockwell painting called Freedom from Want. She took this group of high school students, as she does with anybody who signs up for her classes, which are booked, by the way, months in advance. So if you want to take one, you need to get in line, to a farm where they bought a pig and met the farmer and met the pig and named the pig Wilbur, after Charlotte's Web. Upon discovering that the pig was actually a she, not a he, they simply renamed her Wilburess and then proceeded to slaughter her. What you are seeing here is the commodification of the collapse of distance. This stuff costs a lot of money, okay? It's not cheap. People are paying for this. Not that different from a website in Germany called My Little Farm, which features farm sanctuary-style pictures and biographies of individual pigs and animals. and in which members of My Little Farm can go online and vote for who should be slaughtered next. And when that individual is slaughtered, you will then be mailed parts of his or her body with his or her photo and biography attached. This is the new face of carnism, okay? This is where things are heading in terms of dealing with visibility. By the way, after they introduced this whole scheme, one of the farmers says, after we first introduced our main supplier, Farmer Schultz from the small town of Gomnik, we triggered unexpected pig tourism, Buckman said. The consumers suddenly showed up at Schultz's fence to watch his pigs run around all day. So we're seeing a counter movement to the primary dynamics of distancing and concealment, where it's the collapsing of distance itself that's becoming commodified. Camus Davis's Portland Meat Collective and Germany's My Little Farm, which are, by the way, just two examples drawn from a lot of possibilities, are fueled not by people who want to look away from slaughter, but by those who want to look even more closely at it. Transparency is exactly what they want. But it is transparency which sustains and justifies, rather than challenges, the basic exploitation of other animals. They want all slaughterhouses to have glass walls, because in a world characterized by distancing and concealment, the pornographic thrill of transparency and the courage to look the animal in the face and call her by name before slicing her throat becomes a kind of secular theology in which they find the ethical absolution for their violence. Okay, third sphere of examples comes from the animal activist world itself. So this blog is from a very well-known animal advocacy group in the United States, and it references an undercover investigation that was conducted in November of 2011 at a North Carolina butterball turkey farm. And this investigation resulted in widely publicized footage of horrific acts of violence against turkeys by some of the human workers. The release of this undercover footage, which this animal organization also gave directly to law enforcement, led to the arrest of 6 of the low-level workers that happened to be caught on film. Ronnie Jacobs, age 57, Brian Douglas, age 36, Billy McBride, age 52, Terry Johnson, age 45, Jose Garcia, age 29, and Ruben Mendez, age 25. What's interesting about the arrests of Mr. Garcia and Mr. Mendez in particular is that they were also charged with felony identity theft, presumably for the crime of being an undocumented immigrant in the United States and for using someone else's Social Security number to gain employment, as did most of the workers that I worked alongside. It's striking that Mr. Mendez was charged with a misdemeanor for cruelty towards animals, but with a felony for identity theft. Mr. Garcia, who's featured on this animal rights blog, was not even charged with cruelty against animals, but was charged only with felony identity theft. Now, what's more, not a single manager or owner of the Butterball plant was arrested or even charged, allowing Butterball to release a statement saying that the workers had been fired, those sadistic you-know-whats, those immigrants, and that Butterball condemned their deviant actions in the strongest possible way. To me, there is something deeply saddening about the posting of the mugshots of these 6 minimum wage job workers, these people of color, on the website of the animal protection organization that took the undercover footage. Something that reminds me very much of Lindy England, the low-ranking, working-class army specialist from West Virginia, who was photographed while torturing Iraqi prisoners and detainees in Abu Ghraib prison. As a result of the release of those shocking images from Abu Ghraib, kind of another instance of the politics of sight, England was court-martialed and jailed, while the larger command structure, and indeed the larger society that made her horrific actions not only possible but also probable, remain untouched and unquestioned. Here, in my view, is a clear example of a use of visibility that, no matter how well-intentioned, inadvertently creates scapegoats out of the powerless, while allowing the powerful, and indeed all of us as a larger society, to not only deny our complicity, but to offload it onto another group of people entirely. My next example, which I'll only briefly talk about, is Air Shepherd, which is a reference to Sea Shepherd, but a different organization entirely. I wish I had time to show you their promotional video. They operate in Africa by applying drone technology developed by the US military to locate improvised explosive devices in Iraq to parks in Africa. And the idea is to fly drones over herds of elephants and rhinoceroses in order to detect in advance poachers who might be approaching those herds of animals. I raise this as a troubling instance of the politics of visibility because of the mindset and the language and the approach that this organization uses. When you hear this organization talk about its work, they speak of Africa as if Africa was a blank canvas that they divide into square grids in a very militarized way. I heard a presentation by one of the people who's working on this, a white man from the United States, and he literally said, our job is to get the bad guys out of our parks. There's absolutely no attention whatsoever to the local politics, the local economy, or the local structures that might lead to the poaching of these elephants, nor to the global supply chains that make them possible. All of the targeting of visibility is at the point of enforcement. It's very militarized, hyper-masculinized, and it re-inscribes a deeply colonial visuality that we're all too familiar with in the context of Africa. Let me conclude. Transparency and visibility alone are not sufficient to create political and social transformation. Wielded unthoughtfully or sensationalistically, they are just as likely to lead to a retrenchment of the horrific practices that they are aimed against, as we see with the new carnism movement. And transparency wielded single-mindedly in the service of one cause, without sustained attention to other intersecting forms of injustice and oppression, and to the larger contexts and structures that sustain those forms of injustice and oppression, is likely to lead to inadvertent support for other forms of oppression, as in the felony identity theft charges against undocumented immigrant workers at the Butterball factory farm, or in the scapegoating of those at the very bottom and those who have the least amount of power, while giving those at the top, and ultimately all of us in larger society, a way of saying, oh no, we aren't like that. Despite our deep complicity in the structures that make the actions we condemn both probable and possible. Transparency and visibility are powerful and important. They are, in fact, among the most powerful and important tools that we have in our fight to change the world for animals. And I applaud the work, the brave work, of those who go to great risks to reveal what occurs in animals, to animals in factory farms, laboratories, and slaughterhouses. And I support organizations who penetrate the opaque walls of slaughterhouses and factory farms so that we can better know what happens inside them. My own book is based on that exact premise. But, and this is the plea with which I'll end my talk today, we must learn to wield the double-edged sword of transparency and visibility thoughtfully, creatively, and carefully, and with constant awareness of their many unintended consequences. If seeing is believing, as the popular saying has it, the content of what is believed as a result of the seeing remains endlessly contested and contestable. It remains, in short, political, uncertain, open to multiple interpretations and understandings. And above all else, it remains subject to the warp and the woof of the terrain of power in which it operates. Thank you.